Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is the show where we discuss all sorts of albums of different shapes, sizes, generate a chat, talk about what's going on with them, yada yada yada. So, across this series since, its humble beginnings, we've covered a heck of a lot of drone records, including, a couple of what I would call singular sustained drone albums that just lift you out of place and time and put you in this state of suspension for 40 minutes or whatever, right? I don't know why exactly, but I've always had a fascination with records like this, even if I can't work out exactly what it is that, I'm enjoying about it. I think, for me, just low-end sustained tones are just really satisfying to listen to. So in today's episode, as you can no doubt hear, we have another incredibly monolithic sustained drone album that comes at around 7.5 hours in length. Incredibly long album to listen to, and yet I found this one actually rather, out of all the very long albums we've heard on this show, this one is probably the easiest one I've listened to, which is really weird. So today I present to you the colossal Music Not for Airports by Calineczka. Right, before we start, let's of course ask ourselves the question, who is Calineczka? Well, Calineczka, which is apparently a translation for the name Thumbelina, apparently, is the moniker for one Sixlor Derch, Mikhail Jezrek Stanzik. I have no idea how that is said, I do apologise, I'm sorry. Where they're from exactly, I'm not so sure, but I do know that they are the curator for the record label Important Drone Records, which operates out of Alicante, Spain. So maybe they're from there, who knows? Anyway, Calineczka is responsible for some of the most monolithic drones I have ever come across. Incredibly long sustained drones that just rumble with these incredible freeform abstract compositions on the modular synthesizer that just rumble away with this incredibly physical presence. I find it very fascinating, truth be told, and in this weird way, really satisfying to listen to. And so today we're looking at one of Calineczka's more ambitious records. There's actually a bunch of these from the dude, but we're looking at Music Not for Airports, which is roughly a 7-hour album of 6 minimal low-end murmuring drones. That is, of course, as you no doubt can guess, a wonderful nod to one of the most seminal ambient albums of all time, Music for Airports by Brian Eno, of course. And so from the offset, these tracks on Music Not for Airports are just colossal drones that will just drift you off into the world of imagination as your mind wanders so far and wide. However, there is actually something hidden amongst the recesses of this album, which is what we're going to really dive in today, or I'm going to try my best to dive in anyway, even though it's not what this channel is about, but I think it's going to be kind of interesting and funny. So, just to mention quickly, there's a bunch of aspects that really fascinated me about this particular album. From the incredible lengths of the tracks themselves, ranging from just shy of an hour to, one being over an hour and a half in length, to the consistently unchanging low-end drones being pushed out over and over and over with literally no respite across or changes, across the entire runtime. And then, of course, to the incredibly unusual names of these tracks. So, I discovered this album where I first came across the record label Attenuation Circuit, which is a wonderful record label for some really peculiar sounding albums. It's wonderfully varied and stuff, and this is one I came across and just had to listen to. And so when I first came across this one, I dived into the music first, just letting that low-end rumbling, just push itself onward and onward. And each and every track on this thing just offer up that incredible monolithic drone that just sounds like the murmuring of incredibly loud machinery, pumping and producing and humming away, but miles off in the distance, but it's so loud you can still hear it, if that makes sense. And to be fair to this album, across the 6 tracks, the drones themselves are technically different in terms of their tones. Although, it's weird, because if you listen to one after the other, you're probably not going to notice it as much, as the drones just file right into that background everyday sound, if that makes sense. And yet, there's something really delightful about drone music like this. There's something so incredibly heavy, dense, and very satisfying about hearing it. But what does it all mean, though? Well, so many albums we seem to be exploring within a genre, there is little to no information that we are being told as such. So what we have is the artist's name, the album's name, and these strange track titles that look very much like coordinates of some kind, right? Well, that's because they are indeed coordinates, no doubt, right? What else could they be? And so, much like when we dived into Angelo Vincent Jr., the album Mise en Trope, which was, as mentioned, released on Important Drone Records, which Calineczka runs. Kind of interesting. But much like that album, when we dived into it, we discovered a wealth of information sort of within the very track titles themselves. And right here on Music Not for Airports, we have another mystery just waiting to be unfolded as we dive into the very places that these tracks are named after. So let's find out where the hell we're going then, shall we? So track 1, 46.692822, 6.826892. This leads us to a little location in Switzerland, a cavern known as the Dépôt et Abri des Biens Culturels, which I believe roughly translates to Deposit and Shelter of Cultural Property. And it's a little building located en route de Moudon, somewhere near the village of the Bizzy-sur-Moudon. What is interesting about this building, though? Well, from what I have gathered, from looking into it, this used to be the site of the Lucens nuclear power plant. And according to the website for the very location, it is the only converted nuclear power plant in Europe, which is a pretty neat little fact, I think. Mostly used these days as a storage facility for museums and institutions. And so this is the first little clue into much of what this album is representing behind its incredibly strange rumbling sounds and minimalist album artwork. We have a location that, based on the picture, is almost in the middle of nowhere, truth be told, and that once housed a nuclear power plant. And so this is all well and good, but why this particular place? Well, a little further digging, in 1969, the Lucens reactor suffered an accident leading to a partial meltdown of the core. Being in a cavern, apparently water condensation formed on the magnesium alloy fuel element components during shutdown and essentially corroded them, leading to corrosion products accumulating in the fuel channels, enough to block the flow of carbon dioxide coolant, which in turn led to the magnesium alloy melting and further blocking the channel. Eventually, as you can no doubt gather, it all caught fire, leading to massive problems, as you might have guessed, right? And so, although this was a partial meltdown, the accident didn't irradiate any workers or any of the nearby population, though it did contaminate the cavern itself for many, many years. And so the plant was decommissioned in 1988, and the last of the radioactive waste was removed in 2003, and nowadays it's open to the public as a museum, which is weirdly interesting if you ask me, right? And so I think, from the immediate onset, having dived into what this particular track is about, we kind of know what this album's trying to tell us, I feel. Our first set of coordinates here have led us to a seemingly, innocent location in the middle of nowhere that houses, a sort of dark secret of history of sorts. A cautionary tale, perhaps, but, where else does the album lead? I think we all know, right? And so, track 2, 54.4243 minus 3.4982, these coordinates took us to a little location in England. I will say, when I first looked up these coordinates, I was able to find all these places very easily, but trying to do it again has actually resulted in going to different places. But based on the locations I found the first time I looked for them, I'm pretty sure this is what where Calineczka was trying to lead us. So, hopefully just bear with a bit if that makes sense. In any case, we have found ourselves in England now. We find ourselves at Sellafield, formerly known as Windscale, which is a large multi-functioning nuclear site off the coast of Cumbria, whose primary activities involve nuclear waste processing and nuclear decommissioning. And some digging into this location, apparently it's Europe's largest nuclear site, as well as featuring the most range of nuclear facilities in the world on a single site. And I find the sheer scale of this place truly phenomenal, right? Its history as well is very large and vast, as the site was first established in 1942. So with this information and, with the previous track's location, we instantly understand what this album's trying to present to us, albeit rather esoterically through these incredibly monolithic long-form drones, right? Each track represents the location of a nuclear zone of some sort or kind. And so what's the story behind this one then? So, in 1957, the Windscale fire occurred, which is known as the worst nuclear accident in the United Kingdom, and apparently one of the worst in the world, with a rating of 5 out of 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, or INES. And so, the story goes that in 57, operators of the reactors, which were known as Pile 1 and Pile 2, noticed that the Pile 1 reactor was heating up more than normal. And attempts were made to mitigate the effects, following on from their usual procedures. So, cooling fans were sped up, airflow was increased, and this should have helped with things. However, unknown to the operators, the cartridge in the reactor, it hadn't burst, but rather it had caught fire. This meant that the airflow that they were pumping in was fanning the flames, and thus the fire got out of control. And apparently this fire burned for 3 days, releasing radioactive fallout across the UK and into the rest of Europe, apparently. In particular, the radioactive isotope iodine-131 was released, which can apparently lead to cancer of the throat. And so it's actually estimated that this might have caused as many as 240 cancer cases, with maybe 100 of them being fatal. And so I feel like there's suddenly so much more context for this incredibly vast and intimidating nature of these very recordings, And I think this is, with this understanding, is why they actually feel incredibly intimidating to listen to. They're representative of something I find incredibly strange: nuclear zones. The tracks themselves, it feels like the humming of the machines themselves, the factories, the power plants, and just the emanation of radiation coming from these particular zones, pushing those waves out through our very bodies. And I find that incredibly intimidating, especially in the wake of these very accidents that we are learning about. Let's find out where the rest lead, shall we? Track 3, 34.421389, 141.0325, leads us to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. So this location is the location of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, where following the Tohoku earthquakes and tsunami in 2011, a series of equipment failures, nuclear meltdowns, and releases of radioactive materials caused the largest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl in 1986. And this one had a rating on the INES scale of 7, meaning major accident. Now, what I found remarkable is that this was a non-fatal disaster, with 37 workers sustaining physical injuries and 2 workers being taken to hospital with radiation burns. And so I'm under the impression that this particular accident is ranked among the worst the world has ever experienced, along with Chernobyl, of course, which I think goes without saying. I find this one being ranked alongside it very interesting. I feel, though, to go back into the album, though, it's incredibly evident what's being presented here, isn't it? It becomes a very peculiar experience as an album, as, without this context, you just drift off to the sustained tones. But, with the context, there is this consideration of the wider lasting impact of nuclear fallout generated by, essentially, in most of the other contexts, man-made accidents, but in this case, natural disaster, earthquakes and stuff. And it's all being presented to us as these low-end drones. So even as your brain, just drifts off and stops paying attention to the very drones themselves, those tones still remain in place, consistently throughout its incredibly lengthy runtime, which I find to be oddly similar to the long-lasting effects of radiation itself. The persistence of it continuing to exist for years on end. And what I find interesting is, and a little odd actually, is that without knowing this, and just viewing this album as any others, it would just come across as a long, sustained drone album. But with all this background information, there's something so evident about what's going on here, and that there's so much more going on than what is merely on the surface, that there's something hidden away by secrecy and stuff, and you're not aware of the effects when you just experience it unless you know, if that makes sense. And I find that remarkably interesting. And so we move on to track 4, 40.153293 minus 76.72534. So these coordinates led me to the location of 3 Mile Island Nuclear Facility. And so, like all the other tracks, the location for a nuclear disaster, right? So the 3 Mile accident was the partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island Unit 2 reactor, which released radioactive gas and iodine into the environment. And on the INES scale, this was rated level 5, accident with wider consequences. And what I find interesting about this one as well is that although the accident didn't cause horrific deaths of many people, it did end up garnering a lot of attention that led to the decrease in the building and construction of future nuclear sites. 3 Mile Island was, according to my research, it was built up as this incredibly complex system, with the accident itself inspiring one Charles Perrow's normal accident theory, which attempts to describe unanticipated interactions of multiple failures in a complex system. And so my basic understanding, of it is that, in such a large complex system, especially one like this, this type of accident is, in Charles Perrow's words, unexpected, incomprehensible, uncontrollable, and unavoidable. And it thus makes me think about the entire concept of nuclear energy as sort of like, the testament to man's strength in the creation, of unlimited power or whatever, and how, despite the aspirations of many, maybe it's foolish in consideration to the longer lasting effects of what could happen. As well, why did a system end up being designed in such an overly complicated way anyway? Like, when the priority should be to create something, that's safe and easy for operators to understand, because it's essential that they understand everything that they're working with, if that makes sense. I don't know, maybe, to be fair, I'm actually kind of missing the point here a bit, but it does seem a little off to me. In any case, though, I should mention that, I find it truly fascinating that this album, comprised of these low-end murmuring drones that we have mentioned, it just has me pondering these very issues and considering them. It's weird, But this is the story and mystery embedded within the album itself, which has been disguised to us as simple coordinates, simply waiting to be discovered by our own curiosity, essentially. So track 5, 55.716667, 60.816667. This leads to a rather interesting location, from first glance, it just looks like a forest of some kind, right? Nothing particularly interesting, right? However, we know full well the story and narrative that this album's trying to present to us, and so I don't think we're fooled for a second, are we? So this location, I think, I'm not too sure, is part of Ozersk, not sure how it's said, which is a closed city in Chelyabinsk Oblast, Russia. And so this remains a closed city because of its proximity to the Mayak plant, which is a Russian facility for processing nuclear waste and recycling nuclear material from decommissioned nuclear weapons. And prior to that, it was apparently a source of Soviet plutonium during the Cold War. And so what I find interesting about Mayak is that, between the years of 49 to 51, engineers had run out of space to store their high-level radioactive waste. So, what did they do? Did they find somewhere else to put it that's going to keep it nice and safe and not affect anybody? Of course not, right? They, of course, dumped 76 million cubic meters of toxic chemicals into the Teka River, which the river connected up to around 40 or so villages. So following this, 23 of those villages had to be evacuated. And in the 45 years following, around 500,000 people had apparently been irradiated in one or more incidents, exposing them up to 20 times the radiation suffered by the Chernobyl disaster victims who were outside the plant itself. To add to this, though, this was also the location of another disaster that happened here as well, when an improperly stored underground tank of high-level liquid nuclear waste exploded, contaminating thousands of square kilometers of land. And this matter, of course, was covered up, which comes as no surprise to me, and the full scope of it wasn't really known apparently until around 1980. And so to me, this one comes across as a rather shocking discovery where people's greed, as the engineers dumped materials instead of halting the production of plutonium. And it resulted in so many destructive effects upon so many innocent people and the environment itself. And so it's fascinating me. This seemingly innocent picture of this forest harbours such a deep secret of corporate greed and ignorance. A terrible disaster that, is perhaps unknown by so many people. And as a result, it gives this deep, rumbling, undulating track such a weird context, that makes it makes sense in the very narrative of this very album. And so, where do you go from there then? So, the final track and the final set of coordinates leads us to the final nuclear zone, of course. Track 6, 51.389722, 30.099167. And so, I'd say there's no doubt in my mind that a bunch of you can probably guess where this one leads to. And it is, of course, the location of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located, of course, near Pripyat in the north of the Ukrainian SSR. And there is no doubt in my mind that this is one of the most well-known nuclear disasters in the history of nuclearness, I guess. And it's one that's been covered by so many different channels on YouTube, as well as, discussed in media and stuff. And the accident was, of course, the result of many different problems all colliding together in a truly catastrophic way, with the main issue being the explosion in the reactor itself, which spewed radioactive contaminant throughout the USSR and Europe. And the disaster resulted in the direct deaths of 31 people at the site itself. And it is thought to have resulted in the eventual deaths of maybe thousands of people across the entire world. And so alongside the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, which we discussed earlier, this disaster was also rated 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. And what I found interesting was apparently the emergency response and subsequent efforts made to mitigate damage. It's thought to have costed around 18 billion rubles, which is apparently $68 billion adjusted for inflation in 2019, which is a staggering amount of money. There is, of course, some much more in-depth dives into this very disaster. I could go into it way more detail than I ever could, but I thought I'd explain it just briefly, just because we're here, right? In any case, though, this is what the album has been building up towards, essentially, We started by venturing to nuclear zones, where accidents happened, of many different parts of the scale, before we arrive at what is perhaps one of the most well-known, biggest, and probably one of the more substantial nuclear disasters in the history of the world. And what I find interesting, track 6 is the longest track on this very album, clocking in at just over an hour and a half. And once again, monolithic murmuring drone that is representative of something so incredibly disastrous. And listening to this track now, it inspires this level of fear and tension, as though, just like those engineers who were there at the time, stood by the reactor, staring deep into the heart of it, feeling that radiation emanating in such a horrific and terrifying way. It becomes kind of scary in its own right, but there's something really fascinating about it as a result. And what amazes me is that this only makes sense if one decides to dive into what these coordinates were all representing, if that makes sense. And so this has been quite the journey, if you ask me. Never mind the fact that this is nearly 7 hours of incredibly intense rumbling drone music, but the story that's hidden deep beneath it is one that feels like a very cautionary tale of the world of nuclear zones. And so when I first heard this album, with none of the context here, I kind of delighted in the drones. I found them ominous, yet kind of peaceful in their own weird way, and it was perfect minimal music to just drift off to and probably fall asleep to, truth be told. But after discovering the likes of Angelo Vincent Jr., something like music not for airports, it was a welcome surprise to my Bandcamp collection, as well as a wonderful introduction to Attenuation Circuit. But like that album, after diving deep into it, it just comes across as an incredibly ominous one now that explores some of the biggest disasters that the world has faced, from disasters caused by nature itself to man-made disasters fueled by ignorance, laziness, and greed. And the wub drones of those tracks themselves, as mentioned, it feels like the literal emanation of radiation just consistently pouring through your body for hours and hours on end, doing so regardless of whether you are aware of the fact or not. And even as your mind has just drifted off with the music, the radiation still continues to emanate from these very zones, pushing you further and further into danger itself. And so I have to say, the world of nuclear zones, disasters, etc., it's a really fascinating one, and one that's been covered so brilliantly by YouTuber Plainly Difficult, who has this amazing abundance of videos that go into great detail about all these different disasters, whatnot, including a couple that we've mentioned today. And for me, this is the kind of stuff, I'll be honest, I don't know much about this. This is a music channel, not a radiation channel. But I didn't know much about this before diving into it, but this is one of those things where an entire rabbit hole was revealed the more I dove further and further into it. And I found it fascinating, to be honest with you, which is why I wanted to talk about it on this channel, because I love minimalist works that are representative of something so much larger and grander than what is simply being heard, if that makes sense. And it is discovery of it all that makes the album so much more rewarding to listen to as a result, in my opinion. And so, I think we might as well come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. This has no doubt been an incredibly strange and unusual episode, one that just started in one place and ended up in an incredibly different place entirely, I arrived here for drones, and what I've left with is a peculiar existential look on nuclear zones, right? It's a really weird little hole to have dived into, but No, to be fair, I'm really glad to have finally talked about Calineczka on the channel, lads. I've been meaning to discuss an album of theirs since we talked about his record label Important Drone Records, And, I also wanted to talk about Calineczka because we introduced Angelo Vincent Jr., who released on Important Drone Records, of course, and I wanted to discuss Calineczka because now that we've done so, we might be able to talk about their collaborative album for Steep Gloss. Eventually, maybe. In any case, I'm also glad to have talked about Attenuation Circuit, as discovering discovering the label and discovering Calineczka has led me to some incredibly experimental works, many of which I want to cover at some point, including one I've got a physical copy of that I think is really cool. It's one of those labels, you never know what to expect from them. And everything I've heard, it's all just these wonderful forms of self-expression through the world of experimental music where, as an artist, represent what you're thinking and feeling and stuff, and I think that's awesome. And thus, with that, I'd like to thank you for watching this, another weird long episode of Weird Music, right? I wish you all the best, though. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.